The theme that you have chosen, making Africa better, not bitter, is very appropriate, particularly at this time in the life of the continent of Africa. If you take a mental tour of Africa today, starting from the West, whether you are speaking about Guinea-Bissau, or the Cameroons, or Gambia, or Niger, or Mauritania, or Chad, there is a conflict of some kind. When you think about the big brother in Nigeria and the activities of Boko Haram, not only in Nigeria, but in the neighboring countries, in Cameroon, in Chad, sometimes in Niger, it tells you how urgent the question of peace is. Just this morning, I was watching a documentary in a Western television channel about modern slavery. And it was young men and women from Niger, from Nigeria, from Liberia, being sold in Libya, modern day slavery. And that is because there is no peace. And the question that one must ask when we are confronted with that question, why is it that peace has eluded Africa for the last many years? There was a time when we thought that upon attainment of political independence, Africa would be peaceful. We now have 54 odd African countries which have attained independence. But yet Africa is still in pain of one kind or another. One would have thought in 1961, if only to give an example, that the Democratic Republic of Congo would be peaceful when it liberated ourselves from the Belgians. Yet that country, which is potentially one of the richest countries in the world, is paradoxically one of the poorest. Our men and women are running away to seek refuge in Belgium, in France, and in many parts of the world. There are militias there. The question is, what must Africa do in order to liberate herself from the chains of sorrow? There was a time when we thought that formal education and acquisition of degrees and other qualifications would immunize Africa from violence. Yet it would appear that for every solution we prescribe, there is a problem. One would have thought that if we had enlightened leaders who had gone to the best universities in the world, then your country would be free from pain and sorrow. We had Robert Gabriel Mugabe, whose historical credentials cannot be disputed. But yet, we know that there is no peace in Zimbabwe. And peace is not merely the absence of war. One of the greatest creators of disharmony and violence is poverty. So when we talk about peace, don't think about armed conflict. It is about the dehumanization of the Africans. Why is it that Africa is fertile in the Maghreb? It was assumed that if you gave people certain comforts in countries such as Libya, that you would immunize the country from pain. Of course, we know how some of these osters of our leaders were engineered. Yes, those who thought that if you remove President Gaddafi, then Libya would be in their thinking free. Today, the Libyans who are here would want to attest that there is a sense in which many think, perhaps if we did not remove Muammar al-Gaddafi. There were those who thought that in South Sudan, that if you separated South Sudan and left them to their own design, then you would save the country. Today. You and me know that there is only sorrow and pain in South Sudan. So when we are gathered here this morning and later this afternoon, the question to ask is not to analyze the African problem. Our problems have been sufficiently analyzed. We know that we were enslaved and we are still being enslaved, and it is sad. We know that we were colonized. We know that the neocolonial project is alive and well. But what we need to do, both in the context of the specificities of our countries, because there is not a single Africa. Africa is a continent of many nations. So while fundamentally there are things that will work across Africa, what works in Lesotho is not necessarily what works in Senegal. What works in Ghana is not necessarily what will work in Somalia. What works in Tanzania is not necessarily what will work in South Sudan. If we are conscious of those differences, yet alive to the fact that there is a connectedness within the continent, what President Thabo Mbeki and Archbishop Desmond Tutu called Ubuntu, then we would be beginning to solve the African problem so that we liberate ourselves from bitterness, so that Africa can begin to become better. As I conclude, there is a sense in which we can learn from other civilizations in the recent past. The Koreans had a bitter war in 1953. And I have no doubt in my mind that many a commentator had written the obituary of Korea. Today, South Korea is one of the leading economies in the world. How did they deal with it? How did they use their education to liberate themselves from sorrow and want? Until very recently, I'm aware that Vietnam was at war. I was watching the meeting in Vietnam only last week. Today, Vietnam has liberated herself. She still has her problems, but what lessons can we learn from Vietnam? In other words, as Chairman Wallace said, we have the advantage of having watched other civilizations make a quantum leap. We should avoid the landmines and the difficulties that they encountered, and this can only happen if our young men and women are involved in this agenda under the aegis of what the African Union now calls Africa Agenda 2063. The great Nigerian Chinua Achebe, with whose words I must conclude, once said, in posing the question as to the sustainability of the solution to the African problem, where are the young suckers that will grow when the old banana dies? It is these young men and women, you are the young suckers that will grow when the old banana dies. Peace is the mother's milk of progress. The great Mahatma Gandhi said, and I can't agree with him more, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. And we can only achieve peace if our young men and women are liberated from extremism. The ideology that we must embrace is the ideology of development. That is what will make little Comoros to be a country that is worthy of talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it can be done, it must be done, and we have to play our part. Thank you.